When America talks about Ozzie Smith, it's not just memories of a player, it's memories of a standard that has never been toppled in baseball history. 19 MLB seasons, most of them spent entirely with the street, Louis Cardinals, where he became a living icon of perfect defense. 13 consecutive Gold Glove awards from 1980 to 1992, a record that's almost unimaginable at shortstop. 15 All-Star Game appearances, a rare Silver Slugger Award for a player known more for defense than hitting, the World Series championship in 1982, where he not only protected the infield with flawless plays, but also left his mark with a game-deciding home run in the most prestigious series of a player's life. Over 2,000 hits in his career, a stat that directly refutes the stereotype that he only knew how to play defense. And the absolute pinnacle, the day his name was called at the Hall of Fame with a near-unanimous vote percentage, cementing his place as the greatest defensive shortstop of all time. Those backflips before every game weren't just a show, they were a declaration. Perfection can be repeated, can be sustained, can last a lifetime. But right behind that wall of achievements was a man who had to live with a silent, enduring cost. Every dive across the grass wore down his knee joints a little more. Every landing after a backflip reminded him that the body has limits, even if fame doesn't. The physical pain didn't come in one fateful moment, but built up through thousands of right place, right time plays, until pain became his normal state. Alongside the physical was the mental anguish of a man who wasn't allowed to make mistakes, who woke up every day knowing that half a beat of slowness could shatter the image the whole country had placed on his shoulders. Ozzie Smith didn't fight to become great. He fought not to let anyone down, and that forged an almost ruthless will toward himself. Keep taking the field when his body wanted to quit. Keep smiling when exhaustion sank deep into his joints. Keep upholding the standard, even as that standard began eroding the person inside. In silence, he accepted pain as part of the responsibility, turned discipline into armor, turned willpower into the only way to survive under the lights, and that unflashy resilience created his deepest tragedy. A legend revered by an entire nation, yet forced to carry alone the pain and weight of perfection for his whole life. If the story of Ozzie Smith's perfection and its quiet price makes you pause and think, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring the deepest chapters of his life. Ozzie Smith's childhood didn't start with fairy tales or memories wrapped in gentleness. It began in the thick air of Mobile, Alabama, in the American South, where discipline mattered more than comfort, where boys were taught to be tough before they were taught to show feelings, and where love wasn't given freely, but had to be earned through proper behavior and clear achievements. In that family, there was no open cruelty, no violence or loud tragedies, but there was a simmering void, very few hugs, very rare praise, and almost no soft words to soothe a child learning who he was. Ozzie grew up in an environment where doing it right was duty, while being loved was never spoken aloud, and that very silence taught the boy a lesson he carried his whole life. If you want to be seen, you first have to outperform everyone else. In Mobile, where the harsh sun and brutal pace wore people down in their own way, Ozzie learned to suppress early. He wasn't allowed to be weak, because weakness meant becoming a burden. He wasn't allowed to complain, because complaining was seen as laziness or lack of grit. Every time he fell, he got up in silence. Every time he felt disappointment, he swallowed it, because no one taught him that feelings deserved to be heard. On those long southern afternoons, while other kids found simple joy in laughter and carefree play, Ozzie early understood that joy wasn't guaranteed for survival, but recognition could be. Baseball came to him not just as a game, but as a conditional escape, a place where he could prove he deserved attention, deserved to be named, deserved to be acknowledged. Every throw, every catch wasn't just skill. It was a quiet plea. Look at me. See me. I'm trying my hardest. And in that process, the fear of being left behind began to take root, creeping into every action, every choice of that small boy. Ozzie didn't fear losing in the usual way. What he feared more was becoming invisible, the feeling that if he wasn't good enough, outstanding enough, his presence would lose meaning. The American South taught him endurance, but not consolation. His family taught him discipline, but not that a person's worth isn't only in achievements. So, in Ozzie's soul, baseball slowly became the sole measure of self, and every passing day was an unofficial test. Did I do enough today to be accepted? That was the original tragedy, quiet but persistent, that followed him from the small Alabama fields to the giant stadiums later. Ozzie Smith wasn't seeking joy, because joy was fragile and unreliable. He sought acceptance, because in his childhood world, only acceptance brought safety. And that confusion between being loved and having to prove worth became the red thread running through his entire life, pulling him toward unrelenting perfection, while laying the foundation for a great but deeply poignant journey that lasted until the very end. After those childhood years learning to stay silent to survive, Ozzie Smith entered a phase where many other kids were still enjoying the innocence of play, but he had already started treating baseball like a moral obligation. While friends roamed the dusty red roads of Mobile, laughing until sunset, Ozzie stayed at the field, repeating basic drills to the point of boredom, not to show off or chase fun, but to drive away the vague fear that if he slowed down, if he fell behind even by half a step, his presence would become fragile. Baseball, in his world, was no longer a game. It was an escape from invisibility, and at the same time, a place to punish himself whenever he felt he wasn't good enough. Each practice stretched a little longer. Each throw got repeated one more time, not from burning passion, but from a quiet belief forming. Only by outdoing others would he earn the right to stay. Ozzie didn't allow himself rest, because resting meant slacking, and in his mind, slacking was the door straight to being left behind. He learned to turn fatigue into habit, pain into normal, because no one taught him that a kid had the right to stop, to breathe, to play ball just for fun. Those endless afternoons on the grass became self-examination rituals, where he didn't measure himself by laughter, but by the precision of every move, the cleanliness of every play, and the silence of mistakes reduced to the bare minimum. In that world, a mistake wasn't a lesson. It was proof of worthlessness, so he hated it with a cold hatred. The older he got, the more Ozzie trained, as if atoning for an invisible crime, a fault never named but always present in his mind, the fault of not being good enough to be loved unconditionally. Baseball became the mirror he looked into every day, and if the reflection wasn't perfect, he punished himself with extra hours, extra sweat, extra long silences after everyone else had gone home. He didn't seek praise. Praise comes and goes. But acceptance was different. It had to be gripped tight, with non-stop effort. And so, in silence, the seed of self-destruction began to be planted not through violence or rebellion, but through excessive discipline, through tying self-worth to performance. If I stop, I become worthless. That thought was never spoken, but it controlled his smallest decisions, from waking up earlier than others to staying on the field after the lights went out. Ozzie learned endurance before he learned to dream, learned to perfect every detail before he learned to love himself, and that reversal shaped a person who could withstand pressure few could imagine. But at the same time, it quietly took away something he hadn't yet realized he was losing: the right to rest without guilt. When achievement became the only ticket to being seen, every moment of pause carried the shape of self-betrayal. And so Ozzie kept training, kept pushing himself forward, not because baseball promised happiness, but because it promised acceptance. The only thing he believed was safe. In those years, no one called it tragedy, because on the surface, They just saw a hard-working, disciplined kid full of promise. But deep inside, an invisible rope had been tightened around his soul, forcing him to prove his worth every day. It was from here that the path to unrelenting perfection opened, along with the price Ozzie Smith would pay gradually, year by year, season by season, for the rest of his life. Stepping out from the small childhood fields and the guilt-atoning training sessions, Ozzie Smith entered Major League Baseball with the San Diego Padres carrying more than the dreams of a young player. He carried a fear that had been sharpened over years of silence. Joining the MLB was supposed to be a moment of liberation, where all doubts vanished under the big lights and official recognition. But for Ozzie, it was only the beginning of a more sophisticated test. His defense almost immediately demanded attention. Instinctive, quick feet, soft hands that made the ball seem to find its own way into the glove, and game-reading ability far beyond his years. Yet at the highest level of American baseball, excellence alone wasn't enough. Ozzie stepped into a world where every skill was scrutinized, every strength placed next to an uncomfortable question, and for him, that question always circled back to the bat. He was doubted for not being a strong hitter, labeled a pure defender in a league, increasingly worshipping power and long balls. Every spectacular catch came with a silent reminder that he still wasn't enough, that brilliant defense couldn't cover up modest offensive numbers. Early success, instead of bringing security, became a magnifying mirror for his old insecurities. Even standing on the biggest stage, he still had to prove he belonged there, over and over again. In the clubhouse, on the stat sheets, in the analysis pieces, Ozzie always felt like he was on an endless probation, as if slowing down for one season, faltering just a little, would bring everything crashing down. He never got to feel like someone who had arrived, because in his mind, that destination didn't exist. There were only endless stairs, and every step could slip. That's why Ozzie didn't allow himself to enjoy success. Enjoying it meant letting his guard down, and letting his guard down in his inner dictionary was the start of being left behind. In those early days with the Padres, he trained more than most teammates not to stand out, but to minimize the risk of being questioned. Every time he stepped into the batter's box, he carried not just the desire to get on base, but an obsession to prove he wasn't the weak link. And when his offensive numbers didn't break out, as outsiders expected, the fear didn't disappear. It only changed shape, becoming more discreet, but also more deeply rooted. Success in the MLB, for Ozzie, wasn't a warm blanket shielding him from anxiety. It was a spotlight, shining directly on what he still lacked, making him grip his self-discipline even tighter. He began to understand that at this level, there were no long-term guarantees. Every reputation could fade. Every compliment had an expiration date. And so he lived in constant vigilance, where every season was a new review, every game a repeated exam. The most painful part was that success didn't bring release from the inferiority complex. It only made it more refined, harder for outsiders to notice, but clearer than ever in his heart. Ozzie started to realize that his greatest fear was no longer going unnoticed, but being noticed and then judged as not enough. In silence, he kept pushing himself forward, never allowing himself to believe he had done well, because believing that meant lowering the protective barriers that had helped him survive since childhood. And so, while his MLB career gradually stabilized and his reputation began to take shape, Ozzie Smith still lived as if he were on the edge of an abyss, where only constant motion kept him balanced. Success arrived, but peace of mind did not. Instead, it opened a new chapter of fear more sophisticated, harder to name, and more enduring, a fear that would follow him for the rest of the journey, even as the whole world began calling his name with the words reserved for legends. When Ozzie Smith left San Diego for the St. Louis Cardinals, he didn't just change uniforms, he stepped into an entirely different spiritual world. If the Padres were where he had to prove he was good enough to survive in the MLB, then Street Louis was where he was handed something far heavier: absolute trust. The Cardinals didn't see Ozzie as a work-in-progress project or a player still under evaluation. They saw him as the answer to an iconic position, as a destined piece that could restore order and pride to an organization rich in tradition. In that city, baseball wasn't just a sport, it was identity, collective memory, comfort across generations. And when Ozzie Smith arrived, Street Louis immediately placed expectations on his shoulders greater than any statistic. It was here that the Wizard of Oz was born, not as a catchy nickname, but as a declaration. This man would do what others couldn't, would turn defense into art, and would never make a mistake. The whole city fell in love with him quickly, and passionately loved the backflips that opened every game, loved the defensive plays that left crowds breathless, loved the way he turned seemingly hopeless moments into perfect order. But that love, as warm and genuine as it was, came with an unspoken condition: never disappoint us. For someone who grew up in an environment where acceptance was always conditional, that implicit message wasn't foreign. It was the same thing repeated on a larger, louder, and more dangerous scale. Ozzie understood perfectly that in Street Louis, he didn't just represent himself, he represented the faith of millions, and the smallest mistake could become a crack in that sacred bond. Success came fast and brilliant. Surreal defensive plays became routine, individual awards started piling up, and Ozzie Smith's image became so tied to perfection that people forgot he was still a flesh-and-blood human being. But right in the midst of that absolute adoration, the mental pressure began to spiral beyond control. Ozzie no longer took the field just to compete. He took it to sustain a living legend, and legends aren't allowed to waver. Every game became a silent vow to the city. Today, I will not let you down, and tomorrow will be the same. He began to feel more clearly than ever that the love he received wasn't something he could breathe with. It was something he had to carry on his back. The cheers, instead of bringing relief, became reminders that the standard had been raised, that normal no longer existed in his world. Ozzie didn't allow himself to even think about the possibility of error, because just thinking about it was enough to make him anxious. And so he tightened his discipline even further, pushing himself deeper into the cycle of perfection. The whole city saw a wizard soaring across the grass. But no one saw the nights he brought that pressure home, where silence became the only space to confront the invisible fear that one day the magic might stop working. In St. Louis, Ozzie Smith reached the peak of his career, but it was also here that he began to lose the right to be an ordinary player, the right to make mistakes and get back up like everyone else. Every successful defensive play wasn't just a plus, it was a temporary extension of public faith. And every one of those plays reminded him that tomorrow he had to start over from scratch. The pressure didn't come from doubt, it came from absolute belief. Because when people believe you're perfect, they aren't prepared for the moment you're not. And so, while Street Louis celebrated him as a living legend, Ozzie Smith quietly stepped deeper into the invisible cage of expectations, where love became duty, where excellence became the expected, and where the greatest fear was no longer failure, but the moment he let down the people who loved him most. It was from here that the mental pressure didn't just accompany his career, it began to lead it, driving him forward with a motivation that was both noble and ruthless, laying the foundation for his most glorious years, but also for the deepest, most hidden price he would have to pay later. As Ozzie Smith moved through those early glorious years in Street Louis, perfection was no longer a destination. It became a duty that had to be maintained, a duty with no expiration date. The first Gold Glove arrived as a well-deserved reward for his rare defensive talent, but then the second, third, fourth followed one after another, until the number stopped at 13, no longer a streak of glory, but more like stamps sealed across the seasons of his life. Each year he took the field. Ozzie was no longer asked if he was good enough. It was assumed he had to be the best, that any play less than perfect was a decline, a sign of betraying the image he had built with his own hands. The gold glove, once a symbol of the pinnacle, gradually turned into a golden cage, locking him inside expectations from himself and the entire league. Each season began no differently from a sentence to be served. He had to prove he still deserved the title, the Wizard, that the magic hadn't faded, that age hadn't yet touched his feet, his hands, or his reflexes. In that world, not getting old wasn't just a wish. It was an unspoken command. Not slowing down wasn't just a professional requirement. It was a condition for survival, and not feeling pain was the biggest lie he had to tell himself every day. Ozzie learned to hide the nagging aches, the way one hides a shameful secret, because admitting pain meant admitting limits, and limits had no place in the image of a defensive legend. He took the field with a body that grew heavier day by day, but a mind that grew tighter, because every dive wasn't just a play, it was an affirmation that he was still here, still quick enough, accurate enough, perfect enough not to be replaced. The fans only saw the flawless executions, while Ozzie felt every moment his body lagged even by a fraction of a second, and that obsessive sensitivity never let him breathe easy. Each new gold glove didn't bring relief. It only raised the bar of the sentence, because now he didn't just have to maintain the standard, he had to surpass his own perfect version from the year before. His career became a string of days with no room for error, where every game was an unforgiving exam, and every season a refreshed loop of pressure. Ozzie no longer played to win in the usual sense. His victory wasn't on the scoreboard, but in leaving the field without any trace of decline. He played to survive the expectations, to keep the legend from crumbling, to protect the faith of the city and of himself. In the process, joy slowly withdrew, giving way to heavy responsibility, and baseball, which had once been an escape from the invisible fears of childhood, now became the place where he had to face a bigger fear, the fear of no longer living up to the image he had become. Those years, Ozzie lived in constant vigilance, where every practice was a self-audit, every game a self-judgment, and every season's end wasn't marked by satisfaction, but by a quiet question. Am I still strong enough to do it all over again next year? He didn't allow himself to age naturally, because aging meant accepting decline, and accepting decline meant breaking the unspoken promise to the millions who believed in him. So he kept himself in a prolonged state of tension, where perfection was no longer a choice, but a life sentence, with no appeal, no parole. Ironically, the very awards that lifted him to the top were what chained him to an inescapable loop, where he had to keep proving he deserved what he'd already achieved instead of being allowed to enjoy them. Ozzie Smith became the symbol of endurance and consistency, but the price was the slow erosion of body and soul, something that didn't show in the moments of honor but accumulated in every sprint, every dive, every night coming home with a nameless exhaustion. And it was in this phase, when perfection reached its absolute peak, that his deepest hidden tragedy began to surface. A man imprisoned by the very standard he had created, forced to keep playing not out of a hunger to win, but out of fear that if he stopped, if he slowed, if he admitted the pain, everything he had built would collapse. In silence, Ozzie kept stepping onto the field, kept sustaining the magic, kept the legend alive through every season, even as the cost of that survival grew heavier and heavier, and the person inside began to long for something simple he had lost long ago, the permission to be imperfect. After so many years living in the golden cage of perfection, Ozzie Smith began paying the price with something no award could ever compensate: his own body. His knees were no longer the flexible joints of a young man, but the load-bearing points of thousands of dives, thousands of awkward landings, each leaving a tiny scratch, invisible to the eye, but vividly remembered by the body. His back started aching in a dull, persistent way, not the sharp pain that drops you, but the creeping, clinging kind that turned every morning wake-up into a silent negotiation between will and flesh. The joints wore down gradually over the years, every small movement carrying a warning signal he deliberately ignored, because in the world he lived in, admitting pain meant admitting the magic was no longer intact. But Ozzie didn't rest, didn't speak, didn't complain, not because he wasn't in pain, but because he didn't allow himself to feel pain in a way others could see. The culture he grew up in, the culture of the American South and of elite sports, had taught him an unwritten rule. American men don't complain, they endure. And Ozzie had internalized that rule so deeply, it became reflex, became how he existed in a world of expectations. Every time his knee stabbed during warm-ups, he told himself it was just a passing sensation. Every time his back stiffened after a long game, he saw it as the price for staying on the field. He hid the fatigue behind a calm smile, hid the pain behind movements, so practiced no one noticed anything off. To the fans, he was still the wizard, soaring across the grass. In the clubhouse, he was the first to arrive and last to leave, quietly stretching, quietly bearing the shrinking limits. There was no single marked breaking point, no fateful injury that forced him to stop, just slow, relentless destruction playing out in silence, season after season. Ozzie knew that if he rested, if he let his body recover naturally, the question would come immediately. Would he still be himself when he returned? Would the magic still be whole? And because he feared that question more than the pain, he chose to continue. He took the field with pains that had become constant companions, treating them like part of the invisible uniform he wore every day. In his world, pain wasn't a signal to be heard. It was noise to be silenced with discipline. Those nights coming home, when his body finally let him feel the full exhaustion, Ozzie didn't seek pity or comfort. He just stayed quiet, because silence was the only way to keep tomorrow's image from wavering. His family could sense the change through a slower gait, through moments when he rose with more difficulty, but he rarely spoke of it, because speaking would make the pain more real, and that reality could threaten the role he was fighting to protect. In American sports culture, especially for those seen as icons, endurance is often praised as a noble virtue, and Ozzie became the embodiment of that virtue, even if the price was a gradual disconnection from his own body. He learned to listen to the roar of the crowd instead of the warnings from his joints, learned to trust the rhythm of applause over the rhythm of throbbing pain along his spine. His body was being destroyed, but it wasn't allowed to complain, because in the story America told about him, there was no room for fragility. And so, while the legend was built on perfect moments on the field, the real Ozzie Smith was quietly fighting a silent war, where every day was a victory over pain to keep going, but also one step closer to a limit no one can outrun forever. The most tragic part wasn't that his body was wearing down. It was that he believed the wearing down was necessary, justified, the condition for remaining in the public's heart. In silence, he accepted pain as part of the duty, turned endurance into a moral standard, and unwittingly deepened his own tragedy. A man who had learned to endure too well, to the point of forgetting that a body also deserves to be heard, and that not every pain has to be swallowed to prove worth. After all those seasons stretched out with sweat and silence, Ozzie Smith came home every night with the title of legend, but he stepped into a space where that title couldn't fill the gaps that had grown wider over the years. His family lived with a man who was always physically present, but rarely truly there emotionally. A man who carried the pressure of an entire city into the living room, who carried expectations he hadn't yet set down, even after hanging his glove on the hook. Ozzie was there for dinners, for rushed mornings, for everyday moments that seemed full enough on the surface. But his mind was often stuck on the field in the last play, In the next play, in the invisible fear that if he let up even a little, everything he had built would collapse. To his wife and kids, it felt like living next to a man who was always tired in a way that was hard to name. A man who listened but didn't really hear, who loved but didn't know how to show it, when his mind was so used to holding everything back. Ozzie's success covered up the family gaps in a very convincing way. Packed schedules, constant travel, cheers and praise that made outsiders believe that life was complete. But behind the closed door, emotional absence built up into small, missed moments, unfinished conversations, evenings where the silence stretched longer than it should. Ozzie didn't mean to be distant. He just didn't know how to switch from being the carrier of an entire city's expectations to being a husband and father who needed to be fully present, because his whole life he had learned to measure his worth by performance and perfection, not by closeness. Those years passed at a pace that can only be understood once they're gone. The kids grew up faster than he could notice. Small stories that should have been heard got pushed back after one more season, one more trip, one more game. When success kept knocking, it brought the unspoken promise that the family would understand, would wait, would forgive, and Ozzie believed that promise because it let him keep going without facing the guilt. But time doesn't wait for anyone, and the years that can't be reclaimed quietly closed their own door. The tragedy here wasn't loud. No explosive moments, no public breakdowns, just a distance that grew like a thin but long crack, hard to notice until looking back made it too late. Ozzie began to realize that while he had kept perfection on the field, he had traded away irreplaceable moments at home, moments no award could ever buy back. His family didn't complain loudly because they too were swept up in the story of greatness, of responsibility, of duty to the public. That very silence made the regret cut deeper because there was no voice to push back, no conflict to force him to stop. Ozzie lived in the paradox of a man loved by millions, yet struggling to reach the simplest intimacy in his own home. And when he realized it, time had already left marks that couldn't be erased. The years that passed became memories looked back on with belated understanding. He had done everything to not let anyone down on the field, but in doing so, he unintentionally taught the people behind him to accept absence as normal. That tragedy couldn't be fixed with a late apology, couldn't be patched with scattered make-up moments, because it was built from habits stretched over many years. And, in the quiet of those final evenings of his career, Ozzie began to feel more clearly than ever that success can cover family gaps for a long time, but it can never erase them, that the years that can't come back will always be there, as a painful but honest reminder of the price paid for living fully for other people's expectations. In 1996, when Ozzie Smith left the field, that moment didn't close with roaring cheers. There was no farewell ceremony grand enough to match nearly 2 decades of perfection, and no ritual could prepare him for what waited behind the clubhouse door. His career ended in a way that was quietly cruel. No more fixed training schedules, no more back-to-back flights, no more heart racing with every play, and most importantly, no more clear role to cling to every morning when he woke up. For nearly 20 years, Ozzie had known exactly who he was. Shortstop, the wizard, the man who wasn't allowed to make mistakes until the day he was no longer a shortstop, and that clarity vanished faster than any title could fill. In the first days after retirement, the house was strangely quiet. Mornings came without a destination, afternoons drifted without a specific goal, and time, which had once been sliced into pieces by the game schedule, suddenly became a vast emptiness. Ozzie no longer had the roar of the crowd as a measure of worth. No coaches, teammates, or stat sheets to tell him that today he had done enough. What he had was prolonged silence, and in that silence, questions that had been suppressed for years began to rise. If I'm not on the field anymore, who am I? If no one needs me in the right place at the right time, where does my value lie? He tried to fill the void with old habits, waking up early, working out, staying disciplined, but without a context for that discipline to attach to, it felt out of place, like an instinct left over after the environment had changed. No one had prepared him for how to live when he was no longer needed in a public way. No one had taught him that the absence of a clear role could hurt so much for someone who had tied his identity to a title for so long. Invitations came, events, ceremonies, belated praise, but they arrived scattered, not forming a rhythm of life, and certainly not replacing the sense of belonging the field once gave. Ozzie began to realize that what he lost wasn't just a job, it was the structure of his identity. When that structure collapsed, the remaining pieces didn't automatically find new places. He walked past stadiums that used to be home, watched plays happen without him there, and felt a sense of being robbed in a way that was hard to name. The world still ran smoothly, only his role had disappeared. The absence of cheers wasn't just missing sound, it was missing a measure. No training schedule wasn't just missing work, it was missing a reason to believe today mattered. No role wasn't just an empty spot, it was emptiness in the story of his life. Ozzie, who once controlled every inch of the infield, began losing control over his own free time, because free time was no longer rest. It was a void that exposed old fears never dealt with. He skipped some events not out of arrogance, but because he didn't know where to stand when he was no longer defined by action. He felt out of place amid the praise, because the praise was for the past, while the present had no shape yet. In those long evenings, when his family had adjusted to the new rhythm but he hadn't, Ozzie faced a hard truth. For so many years, he had lived to meet other people's expectations, and when those expectations no longer needed him in the old way, he didn't know what to expect from himself. I used to know exactly who I was, until the day I wasn't a shortstop anymore. That statement wasn't nostalgia. It was an honest description of an identity loss. Retirement didn't come like a painful fall. It came like the pulling away of a foundation, leaving a man standing firm on the outside, but swaying inside. Ozzie tried to find new roles, advisor, mentor, icon, but those roles didn't carry the urgency of a ball rolling toward him at a speed that demanded a split-second decision. He began to understand that some losses can't be made up for with titles, and some voids can't be filled with praise. The silence after retirement wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was long and persistent, forcing him to look straight at a question his career had always dodged with action. What is my value when no one is waiting for me in the right place at the right time? In that phase, Ozzie didn't collapse in the way the world usually calls a breakdown. He stood, walked, lived, but inside, the identity once tightly tied to shortstop had been stripped away, leaving a man who had to relearn how to define himself without the field as an anchor. And that very process of relearning, slow, painful, full of confusion, opened the hardest chapter of his life, where there were no more opponents to defeat, no more scoreboards to prove anything to, only time, silence, and the question of how to keep existing when the role that once defined him had left forever. After his identity was stripped away, along with the glove hung back up, Ozzie Smith stepped into a void he had never been trained to face. A life without baselines, without a countdown, without moments that forced split-second decisions. Those first nights, sleep abandoned him as if it too had retired with his career. Ozzie lay in the dark, body exhausted but mind refusing to shut off. Old images looping like slow-motion tape the grass, the sound of glove meeting ball, reflexes that used to be instinct, then suddenly going silent, leaving a suffocating emptiness. Insomnia didn't come loudly, it came like a new habit, quiet, persistent, wearing down each morning. He woke up not knowing how long he had slept, or if he had really slept at all, and that haze slowly spread into the rest of the day's hours. Ozzie began to withdraw in ways that were hard for outsiders to notice. Still polite, still smiling when required, but gradually avoiding crowded spaces, avoiding gatherings where the question, "How do you feel now that you're retired?" repeated like a small but steady cut. He shied away from the lights, not because he hated them, but because the lights reminded him of a version of himself he no longer was. Standing under that glow, he didn't know what to perform when there was no longer a role to play. Invitations appeared and then thinned out, and when they did come, he thought too long before answering, because every appearance meant explaining his silence, proving he was okay by some vague standard even he couldn't define. The pain now wasn't like the ache in his knees or back things he had learned to endure, but a dull, shapeless feeling without a clear location or name, leaving him fumbling even when talking to himself. He didn't know to call it sadness, because sadness has a reason. He didn't call it fear, because he saw no enemy. He didn't call it emptiness, because he still had family, still had life going on. And it was precisely that inability to name it that made the pain dangerous, because something without a name has no way to be confronted. Ozzie had once controlled every inch of the field with instinct and discipline, always knowing exactly where to stand to turn chaos into order. But now, facing his own life, he was powerless in the quietest way. Free time, instead of being a reward, became the enemy. It stretched, expanded, forcing him to sit with questions never asked when his schedule was packed. He tried to keep rhythm with old habits, waking early, exercising, structuring the day. But without a goal, everything turned mechanical, like drills with no game to test them. When sleep rarely came, it was fragile and easily shattered. One stray thought was enough to wake him, pulling along a chain of thoughts about worth, about whether he was still needed when no one expected a perfect play anymore. Ozzie didn't tell many people about this, not out of shame, but because he didn't know where to start. His whole life he had been taught to act against fear, not to talk about it. And so his depression had no tears, no dramatic signs, just a gradual shrinking of his world, where familiar paths became distant, where the lights that once fueled him now became something to avoid. His family sensed the change in small details, the gaze that lingered too long, the fatigue that didn't fade after a night, the silences that stretched, but Ozzie still tried to hold the calm image, because holding an image was the skill he had honed his entire life. He believed he could overcome it with willpower, because willpower had once carried him through every pressure on the field. But this was a game without clear rules, where sheer will didn't guide the way. Those days followed one another. No collapse, no explosion, just erosion. And in that erosion, Ozzie slowly realized a hard truth. Some battles can't be won by showing up more, training harder, or tightening discipline more. That nameless depression didn't ask how great he had once been, didn't care how many gold gloves he had kept. It simply existed, forcing him to learn a new skill, acknowledging vulnerability that he had never been taught. A man who once controlled every inch of the field now had to learn to accept that there were inches in his own soul beyond his control, and that acceptance, painful as it was the first step out of the circle of silence. But at this point in the story, Ozzie was still standing in the long night, without a name for the pain, without a map for the road ahead, only the old resilience and a question hanging in the air. If he was no longer the wizard, how did he learn to live without losing himself? While the outside world continued to call Ozzie Smith's name with voices full of admiration, while old footage replayed with commentary that never aged, while tributes and praise still arrived as if time had stood still, Ozzie lived long days, trapped in an everyday life, without shape. The public still cheered, still told the story of perfection as an unchanging legacy, and that very cheering made the gap between the image and his inner world more painful than ever. Inside, there was no longer the joy of victory, nor the familiar fear of defeat. Instead, there was a hard-to-name emptiness, as if every drive that once pushed him forward had left with the final out. Ozzie woke each day with the old discipline, but without a goal sharp enough to hold on to. He completed what needed doing, but felt no meaning, and that very lack of meaning tired him in a way physical exhaustion never could. He was tired of playing okay for casual questions, tired of smiling when people said he was so lucky, so fulfilled, tired of not knowing how to explain that glory doesn't automatically turn into happiness. The hardest part wasn't the emptiness itself, but the shame over that emptiness. Shame for having everything others dream of, yet still not feeling enough. Shame for not being happy by the template society assigns to a legend. Ozzie began to blame himself for those feelings, seeing them as a betrayal of everything he had achieved, as if not being joyful was a moral failing. He compared himself to his own legend, and in that comparison, the present self always lost. Public appearances became a double challenge, having to maintain the image while hiding the fatigue, having to retell the old story with enough enthusiasm to convince, while swallowing the feeling that the story no longer belonged to his present. Everyday life, what many see as the reward after a great career, felt to Ozzie like a disorienting space, with no clear rules, no fair measure, no instant feedback to know if he was doing right or wrong. He moved through small tasks, grocery shopping, driving, scheduling, with the feeling of an actor who forgot the script, because his whole life he had been used to every action having direct consequences on the scoreboard. Now the consequences didn't appear, and that blur made him doubt his own value. Ozzie found himself envious of the simplicity of people who had never been icons because they could be sad without explaining, could be lost without being scrutinized. He couldn't. He carried the lights, even when trying to avoid them, because the legend title followed him like a shadow. In the rare moments he allowed himself to admit the fatigue, guilt immediately appeared, reminding him he should be grateful, should be happy, should be proud. Those invisible commands kept tightening even after the field was behind him. This was the deepest bottom of the script. Not a public collapse, not a dramatic event, but a prolonged stuckness between two worlds. A world of legend he no longer lived in, and an everyday life he hadn't yet learned to inhabit. At this bottom, Ozzie had no more opponents to defeat, no more records to break, only a harsh dialogue with himself about whether his value could exist without constant admiration. The fatigue built into habit, the emptiness became the baseline, and the shame of not being happy turned into the final lock keeping him silent. He began to understand that depression isn't just sadness, it's the depletion of meaning, and what makes it dangerous is its normal appearance, its ability to coexist with applause. In the world's eyes, Ozzie Smith had finished brilliantly. In his own eyes, he was learning to exist in a hazy in-between, where legend offered no help for everyday life, and everyday life wasn't yet strong enough to support the tired legend. It was right here, at this deepest bottom, that the story had to slow down, had to look straight at the truth that not every tragedy is loud, and not every pain needs a big cause. Some pains are born from the gap between what people believe about you and what you actually feel. And for Ozzie Smith, that gap had become the deepest pit of the journey, a pit no one saw, but he lived in every day. After hitting the deepest bottom of emptiness, Ozzie Smith didn't collapse in the way people usually imagine. He stood back up, kept living, kept showing up, kept stepping back into the baseball world in new roles, even though inside, nothing felt clear about what he was living for anymore. Ozzie returned to the MLB as an advisor, an icon invited to share experience, to stand on the sidelines and talk to young players about positioning, about reflexes, about the things he once did better than anyone. On the surface, it was a logical continuation, a path every legend goes through, but for Ozzie, Each appearance felt like a quiet reminder that he was no longer the center of the story. He stood there, watching young shortstops run, dive, throw with the energy he once had, and in those moments he realized he was watching his own past unfold without needing his presence. Being an advisor gave a fleeting sense of being needed. When practice ended, when the game started, his role faded into the background, and the familiar emptiness reappeared. Ozzie showed up again at events, ceremonies, moments when the MLB wanted to connect the present to history, but each time he stepped into the lights, he felt more clearly that he was representing a time that had passed. No one said it outright, but the message was everywhere. Your era is over. It didn't carry bitterness, didn't carry resentment. It was just the neutral fact of time, and that very neutrality made it harder to face. Ozzie was no longer called to resolve decisive situations, no longer placed in positions that demanded split-second reactions. Instead, he was listened to, respected, but no longer the one who changed the game. For a man who had always defined his worth by direct impact, this shift created an uncomfortable disconnect between being present and having meaning. He tried to adapt, tried to believe that passing on knowledge was also a form of contribution. But in the evenings coming home, the question still followed quietly. If I'm no longer the center, what do I exist for? Ozzie found himself moving between two states. One, the effort to keep going. The other, the confusion about purpose. And neither fully won out. Those returns to the MLB didn't bring the revival he once hoped for. They were more like mirrors, reflecting the distance between a brilliant past and a hazy present. He smiled for the fans, signed autographs, took photos, but deep down understood that those moments belonged more to other people's memories than to his own present. The feeling of being pushed out of the center wasn't rejection. It was the natural shift of time, and that very naturalness made it hard for Ozzie to resist, because there was no one to blame. He began to realize that continuing to live didn't mean he had found a reason to live. There were days filled with activity, but lacking an inner anchor to tie them into meaning. Ozzie no longer fought depression head-on, but he hadn't escaped it either. He existed in a halfway state where every attempt to fit in carried the feeling that he was playing a supporting role in his own life story. Those around him saw a humble, calm legend, but no one saw the mental fatigue of constantly reminding himself that he still had value, even when he was no longer the center. Every appearance, every formal introduction, every brief round of applause carried a double message. You were once so great, and because of that, your present will never outshine that shadow. Ozzie began to understand that the hardest part wasn't leaving the field. It was learning to live in a world where his greatness had become history. He tried to keep living, tried to be present, tried to contribute, but deep down, he still wrestled with an unanswered question. When you're no longer the one deciding the game, no longer the standard of perfection, how do you learn to exist without being swallowed by the feeling that your time has passed? And it was that prolonged wrestling, not collapse, not release, that most clearly defined this phase of Ozzie Smith's life. A legend trying to keep living in the everyday, even though he hadn't yet found anything strong enough to replace the field that once was the center of all meaning. The final recognition did come to Ozzie Smith, but it came late, and in a quieter way than people usually imagine for a legend. The day his name was called at the Hall of Fame was the moment the entire baseball world agreed that what Ozzie had done wasn't just excellent, it redefined the standard for a position. His jersey was hung high, no longer colliding with sweat and dirt, becoming an eternal symbol of celebrated perfection. The speeches recounted the 13 Gold Gloves, the unimaginable defensive plays, the flawless seasons, and people spoke of him in the language of history where every detail had been polished into formality and completeness. His entire career was acknowledged in a way that left no room for dispute, like a final verdict closing every doubt that had ever existed. But standing in the lights of induction, Ozzie felt a clear, uncomfortable truth. That recognition didn't heal the years of self-destruction, didn't erase the sleepless nights. He didn't give back the mornings. He stepped onto the field with an aching body and a mind rigid from the fear of upholding the standard. The Hall of Fame confirmed he had been right, but it couldn't undo the choices he had to make to never be wrong. The jersey hung high freed him from the pressure to take the field, but it couldn't free the memories of seasons where every game was a sentence to be served. The honor arrived like a formal period at the end of his professional story, but his inner life didn't run on periods. It carried long, lingering lines where fatigue and emptiness still found ways to slip between the congratulations. Ozzie stood there, smiling, thanking, humble as he had always been, but inside, he understood that the world's acknowledgement didn't mean reconciliation with himself. People talked about legacy while he thought about time. People talked about eternity while he thought about youth spent in discipline and endurance. No moment in the induction ceremony could return the years his family stood behind him. The evenings he came home with a broken-down body and a mind with no room left for full presence. No speech could erase the deep-rooted habit of self-punishment or teach him how to look back without regret. The late recognition carried a paradox. It affirmed that every sacrifice had been worth it, while he himself knew there were prices that couldn't be converted into awards. Ozzie didn't deny the glory. He just understood that glory wasn't a cure. It didn't rejuvenate the worn-down body, didn't lighten the memories of swallowed pain, and didn't change the fact that he had learned to live for other people's expectations before learning to live for himself. In the days after the induction, when the lights went out and the jersey rested high, everyday life returned with its slow rhythm and old questions. Ozzie walked past stadiums as an icon, greeted with respect, but the halfway feeling remained. History had embraced him, but he himself was still learning to embrace himself. The belated honor was like time's sincere but irreversible apology. It said the world had seen him, had understood him, but it couldn't give back the years he had traded for the world to finally see. And in that mature realization, Ozzie began to understand that the value of the honor wasn't in making the past less painful, but in allowing the present to become more honest. He no longer had to prove anything, no longer had to uphold the standard, and that very late letting go opened a new space, fragile, not loud, where he could begin to look back at his life without continuing to punish himself. But even so, the truth remained. The Hall of Fame didn't heal the years of self-destruction, didn't return youth, and didn't erase the price of prolonged perfection. It simply stood there, like a bright milestone, reminding that some victories are recorded in history and some losses are carried only in the silence of the man who lived fully, for expectations only to learn how to live more slowly once everything had been recognized. At the age of 71, Ozzie Smith no longer runs on the grass with those illogical spins that once made the whole world hold its breath, but his body still carries the traces of every season gone by, like numbers etched into bone. Chronic pain has become a silent companion. His knees remind him every morning when he rises a beat slower. His back stiffens after short walks. His joints no longer obey commands instantly the way they did in his youth. Moving slowly isn't just a physical change, it's a constant reminder that time has taken what he once considered a given. Instant reaction, the feeling of mastering his body, the belief that tight enough discipline would make everything obey. Ozzie walks more carefully, not out of fear of falling, but because he has come to understand that every step has consequences, and that understanding arrived later than he ever hoped. In quiet moments, he looks back at his life with eyes no longer as harsh as before. The standards that once choked him are set down, one by one, revealing the full picture of a life lived for perfection. Ozzie doesn't regret. He understands those choices made him who he is and built his legacy, but the absence of regret doesn't erase the sorrow. Sorrow for not knowing to stop sooner, for not realizing some victories didn't have to be won by grinding himself down, sorrow for bringing the pressure home, letting family years pass in silent acceptance. His soul owes a debt, not to the fans or to history, but to himself, a debt of gentleness he never gave at the right time. Ozzie realized he lived up to the role the world assigned him, but he learned to love himself much later than when it was truly needed. Mornings at 71 begin slowly, deliberately, listening to his body, and in that slowness, he finds a new kind of freedom. No need to prove, no need to compare, no need to satisfy invisible expectations. He remembers the plays not with longing, but with gratitude. Gratitude for having had that body, those reflexes once, and gratitude for surviving the pressure few could endure. But at the same time, he allows himself to acknowledge the accumulated fatigue, allows painful memories to exist without justification. At this age, Ozzie understands that belated insight can't fix the past, but it can make the present kinder. He speaks slowly, thinks long, and when he talks about his career, he chooses words that don't embellish, not to diminish the glory, but to place it in its proper spot. The scarred body is an undeniable truth. The indebted soul is what he learns to repay gradually by living differently, listening more, being present more, and allowing himself rest without guilt. No regret, because he did what he believed was right in the context of the time, but full of sorrow, because now he sees other paths he never took. And in that intersection of acceptance and sorrow, Ozzie Smith at 71 is no longer the wizard of the field. He is a more complete human being, scarred, indebted, but finally allowing himself to slow down, to repay that debt with understanding and kindness toward himself. No miracle appears at the end of Ozzie Smith's story. No moment of complete healing where every scar vanishes at once. No final victory to close the journey with roaring cheers. What remains, when the lights are off and the story no longer needs a climax, is a character forged through years of endurance, a legacy etched deep into the sport's memory, and a man who lived true to his role and paid the full price for it. Ozzie isn't redeemed in the romantic sense. He doesn't wake up one day to find all the pain gone. The body still bears scars, the mind still has heavy days, and the memories of pressure don't fade like mist. But he doesn't collapse either. He stands firm in a quiet way, accepting that life doesn't always reward fairness on schedule. Ozzie learns to live with what can't be fixed, learns to name the losses without self-blame, learns to put the past in its proper place, not to deny it, but to stop letting it control him. In this ending, there is no spectacular resurrection, only the persistence of a man who walked the path he chose to the end, even though that path demanded more than he was ever promised. Ozzie's character shines clearest when there is no scoreboard. Unflashy humility, responsibility without blame, and honesty with himself, especially when admitting the price of perfection was very high. His legacy isn't only in the 13 gold gloves or the unreal defensive plays replayed endlessly. It lies in the ethical standard of professionalism, in the way he never allowed himself to cheat the game, in accepting the burden of expectations without shortcuts. But that legacy also carries a silent warning. Greatness achieved through self-grinding leaves, long-lasting aftershocks. Ozzie doesn't regret living true. He only sorrows for paying too high a price to stay true to the standard. And it's that subtle distinction between regret and sorrow that makes this ending maturely tragic. No weeping, no resentment, only full acknowledgement. Looking back, he sees a boy who once sought acceptance through endless effort, a young man who carried pressure with iron discipline, a legend trapped in everyday life because he was never taught how to let go. All those versions aren't erased. They're placed side by side. So finally, Ozzie can see his whole self complete with flaws. No final victory, because victory implies a loser. And here there is no one left to defeat. Only continuing to live at a slower pace, with gratitude for what was, and compassion for what was lost. Ozzie doesn't need a glorious ending to prove his worth. That worth was already proven by never betraying the game, never betraying the effort, and finally, never betraying the truth about the price of perfection. This man paid the full price through sweat, through pain, through family years standing behind, through quiet nights after retirement, and because of that, the ending doesn't need to be beautiful to be right. It only needs to be honest. And in that honesty, Ozzie Smith stands as a man who played his role true, bore his full share, leaving us not an illusion of eternal happiness, but an enduring lesson. Greatness is real, but humanity is rarer. Success can be measured by titles, but character is measured by how we face its price. Looking back at the entire story of Ozzie Smith, the emotion that lingers isn't the exhilaration of glory, but a deep sadness for a man who lived his whole life within the framework of mandatory perfection. From childhood in Mobile, Alabama, where love came with conditions and praise was rare, Ozzie learned a bitter lesson. To be seen, you're not allowed to be wrong. That lesson followed him through his entire MLB career. From the early years with the Padres always having to prove his worth because his hitting was doubted, to the street Louis Cardinals, where he was worshipped as the Wizard of Oz, but simultaneously imprisoned by the expectation never let them down. 13 Gold Gloves weren't just historic achievements in this story. Each one was a season he was forced to serve a sentence of perfection, despite torn knees, aching back, and a body grinding down without permission to complain. The tragedy became clearest after 1996, when he retired. Losing the shortstop role meant losing identity, leading to nameless depression, insomnia, withdrawal, and shame for not being happy despite the adoration. Even the Hall of Fame and the retired jersey couldn't heal the years of self-destruction or return the youth he traded away. This story honors Ozzie not only for his superhuman defensive legacy, but for the character of an American man who lived up to his responsibility, paid the full price without complaint. The lesson for Americans is profound and real. Success and discipline are core values of American culture. But if self-worth is measured only by performance and external expectations, even legends can lose their way when the lights go out. Ozzie's story reminds us that true greatness isn't only in never being wrong, it's in allowing yourself to be human, knowing when to stop, and living fully with family, health, and yourself before the price becomes too high. If the story of Ozzie Smith makes you pause and reflect on the real price of greatness, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue joining you on journeys, honoring the legends behind the spotlight. Thank you for listening all the way to the end, and see you in the next video where we keep telling stories not just about success, but about the human being standing inside it.